Former President Trump's legal team is calling on the Supreme Court to block efforts by the House Select Committee on January 6th to request all White House documents and communications from that day pertaining to the president, vice president, and more than 24 of the highest-ranking officials in the federal government. Trump's legal team argues that this request is untethered from any valid legislative purpose and exceeds the authority of Congress under the Constitution and the Presidential Records Act. Here to weigh in, civil litigator and constitutional lawyer Bruce DelValle. Bruce, it is great to have you with us this evening.
Kilmeny, the fascinating thing about the position here is there is no constitutional right for Congress to investigate. It's not in the Constitution. Additionally, there is no constitutional immunity given to the president. It simply is not there. So here we are. I think that what we are looking at is something that's new territory, new ground. Justice Roberts said so himself when the last time the Supreme Court looked at the issues relating to congressional subpoena efforts against President Trump on the private tax question. The issue there was decided with sort of a chiding sub-reference by Justice Roberts. He wasn't very pleased with the House's efforts to ask for everything, sort of their Veruca Salt approach, which was, I want it all, and I want it now. Now, he did say to President Trump that there was not a blanket immunity, but he was very careful to point out that the preservation of the separation of powers is the primary issue here. It's really what's going on. That's the issue. It's not constitutional. So what you have to look at, in Justice Roberts' own words, and remember, this decision was handed down less than a year and a half ago, you have to have an intelligent legislative activity that's tethered to the congressional inquiry. I don't know that there is here. Justice Roberts warned, once again, he's the Chief Justice, warned that congressional activity against the president, congressional subpoenas against the president, cannot be political. I think this one doesn't pass the muster.
So you'd agree that, when the committee is requesting former President Trump's schedule, call logs, legal documents, briefing materials, campaign polling data, and every White House email concerning the president on that day, January 6th, you'd seem to side with what Trump's legal team is saying, which is what they're implying, that it's unconstitutional.
Well, I don't know if it's unconstitutional. It's just not proper. I'm not to split hairs here. It's the propriety. Generally, these things are worked out between the president and Congress. Generally, they debate, they work together, they try to figure out some way to get this done. This Congress can't seem to do that when it comes to President Trump. They just can't seem to cross that Rubicon. The issue here, though, becomes whether or not, first of all, whether or not the Supreme Court hears the case. I'm not convinced they're going to hear it. I think there's a good chance they decide not to hear it. And then what happens next? What does President Trump do? Well, if I were advising him, I would strongly suggest that he ignores the subpoena, because here's something that no one seems to remember. This subpoena expires in 2022. No House action can extend past the term of the House. The term of this House ends and the election's in 2022. So nothing can happen. Nobody can run to court and make something happen. And certainly the Department of Justice doesn't seem to have the stomach or the intestinal fortitude to try to indict President Trump, nor should they. So I think what we might see here is this is all grand political theater and fundraising for the Democratic Party, but at the end of the day, the subpoena will either be forgotten or ignored and not enforced.
Now, Bruce, what national security implications would there be should that information be released or disclosed to the January 6th committee?
Well, one of the things that's a very good question, and one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet is the executive privilege applicable to a former president? Now, interestingly enough, there is some historical precedent. Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, refused to extend the presidential privilege, executive privilege, to Richard Nixon. However, George W. Bush, a Republican, extended that courtesy to Bill Clinton, a Democrat. Unsurprisingly, President Biden, a Democrat, hasn't extended that courtesy to former President Trump, a Republican. So it's a one-way street with the Democrats here. So as far as the national security interest, certainly there could be some issues relating to how the president conducts business, how the White House works, the inner workings of the White House, the scheduling, the meetings. Certainly I don't know how that works. I don't think anyone else does either, because it is a privilege, and it is a privileged secret. I think there could be some national interest implications here. Clearly, Joe Biden and the Democrats aren't worried about that, though. They're trying to make their political bones here, and that's what's going on.
Yeah, Bruce, I think you raised one of the most important points, which is the fact that this may not actually land at the Supreme Court at all. We'll see if they even take up the case in the first place. Bruce, as always, great to have you with us. Thank you. More Spicer and Company next.
Information. Truth is freedom. Is Newsmax. It's real news for real people.